Lunchtime talk in science and mathematics. This is the second to last presentation that we have for this semester. I think Dr. Benson is giving one on December 8th or thereabout. It's a Thursday, that first week of December, on GIS in a campus setting, along with Scott Travis and Kevin Daniel from Facilities and Computing Services, respectively. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our today's speaker. This is Dr. Nick Saenz from the History program. We're always happy to have folks from elsewhere on campus come into Porter Hall and help us better understand scientific process and how it, I guess, connects with their area. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Matt. So it is pretty exciting to be here. I get to talk a little bit today about history of science, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that here in a moment. By training, I'm a modern Hispanist, so I work on 18th, 19th, 20th century Spain, and also its overseas empire. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of some research that's been emerging over the past 15 years or so, looking at ways in which Spanish America and the larger Hispanic world are actually integrated into a system of scientific exploration and discovery that up until quite recently, just nobody really thought about, right? And in part, you can impute that to sort of problems and larger narratives about who creates knowledge, typically coming from Northern Europe and not from Southern Europe. And I think ultimately the ramifications here for us living today in the United States and thinking about the broad variety of ways in which science can be practiced sort of helps us to contextualize what we do here at a place like Adams State. So to start, I have a little bit of a pop quiz for you. So a little interaction here. Hopefully those of you in the room who are the students should have the answer to this. Hopefully your students, your professors have sort of hammered this into your head by now. But take a minute, maybe a couple, and talk about what the scientific method is. What does it involve? Who does it? Where do you do it? These sort of questions here. And then I'm going to ask for some feedback from you guys to sort of formulate a definition of sorts. Don't be too shy. Try to see what you can remember here, right? Were you not sure? All right, so it seems like there might be a little bit of a dent in the conversation. So I was worried that the mathematicians scowled a little bit when the conversation of the scientific method came up. But what sort of characteristics go into the scientific method? Okay, formulation of questions, a hypothesis maybe that you want to follow through with some experimentation. Other features that typically go into this. Yeah. Okay, ultimately get at a conclusion of sorts. Anything else? Who typically practices the scientific method? Everybody, in some sense. That's an important. I think that's important to think about, right? Even when you were, in middle school, and before that in elementary school, and you were in science class, and you were doing laboratory experiments. In a sense, you were scientists, right? Full-fledged, maybe not fully credentialed, but already practicing it in part. Where do you practice science? Everywhere as well. Yeah, so not necessarily confined to the formalities of a laboratory, but in a sense, as I'm sure Dr. Benson can back me up on this, you go out into the field on occasion and you pull samples, right? And it doesn't have to be in the confines of, say, a university campus necessarily. So this is a definition I randomly pulled from the internet. I don't necessarily think it's a great one. But one thing I think in here, or that I think is really interesting in this definition, is this emphasis on the 17th century, right? So the 1600s, that's in a sense when the scientific method is born. or so history up until late has sort of taught us, right? The whole notion of the scientific revolution tied to the formulation of the scientific method. It's at that point that modern science is born, and from that we get all of the sort of fruits that we enjoy now in our modern world because in part of science. So you've probably seen something that looks like this, right? The formal steps of a sort of ongoing process where you make observations, you think of interesting questions, you formulate hypotheses, you then seek to test them, gather some data to test those predictions. You might have to go back and do this a few times ultimately until you're able to get at general theories, which might in turn precipitate more questions that would return you to the scientific method over and over and over again to continuously refine the ideas that you've been developing. So that's in a sense what I want you to keep in the back of your mind when we're thinking about whether or not the scientific method is developed in the 1600s or maybe even before. And the other sort of context or background I want you to think about is the history of science. So this is a relatively new field. In my graduate school, there was a large number of persons working on the history of science, so persons working on the history of how science is used in legal arguments, the social ramifications of the theory of evolution in 19th century Britain and other parts of Europe. There's a whole variety of ways in which science, and this perhaps should not be surprising to those of you here, really affect society and also culture. But is sort of a given as that might seem until fairly recently in historical terms. That wasn't necessarily a given. In part, it was a publication by Thomas Kuhn that kind of put out this idea that so often we refer to paradigm shifts, and I don't know if we necessarily think about where they come from. He's sort of the guy that popularized that idea. And Kuhn basically said there is a sort of lag that exists between the scientific community and the rest of the world, so to speak, with new technologies, new scientific ideas. I think a great example to throw out there is something like global warming, right? Something for which there exists pretty broad consensus among members of the scientific community, but for the rest of the world, or maybe not the rest of the world, the rest of this country is widely contested, right? So this notion of a lag existing is the thing that really, I think, made historians sort of curious here, right? Where do we see that lag existing? What are the ultimate implications of that lag at a social and cultural level in the context of various societies across time and also space? So some things to think about here. How does this all matter, right? A previous generation of scholarship would say, oh, science, it's a world unto itself. It's its own discipline. It doesn't have any effect. But you could make really strong arguments for science playing a really profound role in later historical events. So something like the discovery of the New World, right? This notion that the Bible doesn't reference anything about there being a whole other hemisphere on the planet, a whole variety of creatures that were not referenced, undermined in part the authority of the church. For some historians of science, in part explains why you have something like the European Reformations, right, which are a direct assault on the authority of the Catholic Church. Flash forward to the French Revolution, and the revolutionaries there are throwing out religion altogether, right? How do you get to a secular world? In part, something like the earth-shattering significance of the discovery of the New World in part explains a sequence of events that unfold that don't inevitably necessarily, but very likely make a sequence of events more likely to happen in some sense. Another example here, right, I think several of you snickered, you probably know something about this cartoon, right? This is Charles Darwin characterized in the 19th century, caricaturized in the 19th century for his belief that man is descended from a primate. If you read on the descent of man, and I had my students in 19th century Europe do it earlier this semester, Darwin's a little cagey on the subject of race. He doesn't know quite how to deal with it, but it's later scholars like Herbert Spencer who really run this notion with this notion of a survival of the fittest, right? The idea that can't only be applied to specific species, but also society at large, right? That human societies can be a struggle between classes, between ethnic groups, between races, between religious groups, largely serves to support a lot of racial thinking in the latter part of the 19th and early 20th century, right? So Darwin doesn't necessarily put that idea out there in a really firm sense, but others later run with it. Others use those same ideas, sort of riffing off the ideas of Herbert Spencer to say, well, if, the world is a constant struggle between these forces, and some are obviously better than others. In the case of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, well, the German super race is obviously better than others, and we have a legitimate right to wipe everybody else out, right? So in some sense, you can understand, at least in part, World War II by looking to previous sequences of events that played out all the way back in the 19th century. And at least that's sort of the arguments behind history of science. So what I want to throw out there is this notion of the scientific revolution and who practices science. So some of you might have read in textbooks when you were going through sort of high school, maybe even college, the notion of a Baconian revolution, right? This notion that Sir Francis Bacon is at the center of the scientific process, that it's largely his publication in 1620 of the Novum Organum, which he basically writes as a response to a much older text by Aristotle, the Organon, that lays the seeds for the later scientific revolution, right? In a sense, he's the one that puts out this notion of induction as being ultimately of primary import in developing new theoretical constructs for scientific decision-making, right? Aristotle's ideas had largely been upheld by the church, and so this is a paradigm shift, right? He was saying basically, no, that whole argument for how you come to draw conclusions is wrong. Now, I should say today, arguably, the scientific method is kind of a mix of induction and deduction, right? It's not truly one or the other. But removing from the equation this notion that you start with a theory and then you fit data to make it work is ultimately not the best way to do things, is undermined by Bacon. Bacon in many ways is the first to throw this idea out there, to say, well, Aristotle might be this profoundly brilliant thinker and a foundation of Western philosophy, but he didn't get everything right. And maybe we can move past that. And that's really important. But I think because of this text, Bacon gets, in a sense, too much credit for starting something that was already well underway before he started putting pen to paper. What I think is also a little bit problematic about Bacon is that because he is English, right? He writes, both in Latin, as you can notice by the title here, but also in English. His ideas become really popular in the European northern areas. So not only England and the other sort of constituent nationalities of the British Isles, but also the Low Countries and North Germany, other Protestant areas. Ultimately, the United States as well, right? So we sort of consider ourselves in part to be a continuation of British culture, at least beginning at the 13 colonies, to say nothing of what happens in the American West, right? So there's been this sort of notion that, well, science started in England. Of course, who would start science but the English, because of a notion of English exceptionalism, right? The English were just somehow better than everybody else. They were Protestant, so they weren't backward Catholics, right? Playing into this is a notion of the Black Legend. This idea that the Spanish Empire was particularly cruel and bloodthirsty and violent, right? You have the Inquisition there. Surely knowledge and science could not be born in such an environment. It would have come out of this more supposedly peaceable, more logical, more reasonable North Atlantic community. And that creates a bias that in many ways I think still lives with us today. So largely removed from the mix, with a few exceptions, are Southern Europeans. And I'm not just focusing here on Spaniards, but also the Portuguese, right? The Portuguese essentially start the age of navigation. They're largely credited with bringing new systems of navigation to Europe, but I doubt many of you could name many Portuguese scientists from the early modern era. You probably can name a few from Italy, right? Galileo Galilei probably springs to the fore, and he's ultimately pretty well celebrated, but he's not the only one by any means. Now, unfortunately, just because of my background, I'm not as familiar with Portuguese history in this period or Italian, so I'm going to focus on the Spanish case, which takes us ultimately to some of the research that has come out of late. I have copies of all these books up here if you're curious after today's lecture, if you want to take a look at them. This gives you a sense for some of the recent scholarship that's been taking place in this area. So Antonio Barrera Osorio recently published a book, Experiencing Nature, the Spanish Empire and the Early Scientific Revolution. You'll notice his book over here. I always love pointing out this picture. This is basically the first image that Europeans have of a buffalo. So imagine, right, that they're hearing all these reports of these fantastical creatures coming in from the old world. You know, maybe there's still unicorns to be discovered. There's these weird animals that are kind of like cattle who number in the hundreds of thousands, possibly. Europeans are trying to make sense of all these reports. In part, looking back to what they know about what the Bible says, what other sources of authority say up until that point, but increasingly what they're doing, and this is Barrera Osorio's argument, and this is what I'll sort of unpack here in a moment, they're in a sense using science to make sense of these things, right? So they're not necessarily thinking in scientific terms. They're not saying they're using the scientific method, but they're beginning to use the sort of practices that today, in a sense, we pretty much associate with the scientific method. Another figure here, Jorge Penitas Esguerra, who teaches at UT Austin, has been fairly prolific on this subject. So noting the sort of connection between the natural world, empire, and also nation making, right? The notion that these scientific developments should be used for the betterment of the nation, to aggrandize Spanish at the expense of other competitors in Europe, have begun to gain traction as well. But you notice these kind of coincide with the age of exploration, the late 15th, 16th, and early 17th centuries. Of late as well, there's also been a lot of research on the Hispanic Enlightenment. Up until fairly recently, most scholars outside of the community working on Spain would have had dismissively has said there was no such thing as a Spanish Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment was something that happened in France, to a lesser extent in England and northern Germany, but those southern Europeans, they were not enlightened, right? They were Catholics. They couldn't possibly have been enlightened, right? I kind of joke here, but that's basically what you read when you encounter some of these older texts. Daniela Blakemar recently published this text, Visible Empire, Botanical Expeditions and Visual Culture in the Hispanic Enlightenment. And her book actually just won the most prestigious prize in the historical profession. So this is, as of last year, the best book in history on any subject. And so this has gotten a lot of attention of late. Also, Neil Safier, who he runs the John Carter Brown Library in Providence, Rhode Island, published a book on measuring the New World, looking at scientific expeditions that went to basically what is today Ecuador, what was then part of the Spanish Empire, trying to measure the curvature of the Earth. Right? So they're going to Latin America as a site for scientific exploration, and then bringing that knowledge back to Europe to explain, this is how the world works, in a sense, which I think really offers us some interesting insights into where science is produced. So, it's worth starting with the idea that the Iberian Peninsula, and by that I mean both Spain and Portugal, lie in a really unique geographic place in the context of late medieval, early modern Europe. Right? So this is also somewhat of a joke in the historical profession, but there's a famous historian by the name of Henri Pirenne, who's a French historian, who came up with a so-called Pirenne thesis, which basically says Europe stopped at the Pyrenees. Right? Those people south of the Pyrenees, those Iberians, not Europeans, right? And the argument was largely about feudalism and the idea that, well, maybe the Spanish didn't have a truly feudal culture. But there's also a notion here that, well, they were ruled by Muslims. The Christians in the north don't really recognize that. The Spanish world and the Portuguese world are very different, and so we're not going to consider them part of the community of civilized Europeans. But that history is really important, right? So 800 years of cultural mixing between Jews, Christians, and Muslims who are ruling the peninsula for most of that period are really important in introducing ideas from all of these areas. So notably, the Arabs are bringing into the Iberian Peninsula a lot of Eastern knowledge, right? Notions like navigation, right? The astrolabe, the compass, which we're not totally sure where it originated, but China's probably a good guess. The way in which those technologies enter Europe is largely through the Iberian Peninsula. So because of this overlapping history, the Iberian Peninsula resides at a sort of unique position where it can also share that knowledge with the rest of Europe, or the rest of Europe becomes very interesting in sort of getting access to that information, right? There's a reason why the Spanish and the Portuguese largely lead exploration and ultimately colonization of much of Latin America, because they get access to that knowledge first, right? They know how to send their ships places. Meanwhile, the English and the French kind of don't have a clue. So why, or how rather, does all of this sort of get isolated in one institution? Well, the crown in Spain does not use the same structure of the state for colonizing new areas as you might be more familiar with in, say, English history, right? In English history, typically there's things like the East India Company, chartered corporations that are given access to designated areas to explore, to possibly find exploitable resources, and then reap the benefits of those resources, right? So you have things like the Hudson Bay Company that's access to northern Canada. In Spain, there is an office created. We joke in the Spanish historical community that the Spanish are really bureaucratic, really litigious, which can be somewhat problematic, in our day-to-day life. But as a historian, it's wonderful, right? Because they leave all of these documents for us to look at. The Casa de Contratación was established in Seville in 1503. This is what it was probably looking like when it was built. This building is no longer there. This is roughly what survives today. So rather than giving a corporation a monopoly on the exploration and use of the New World, the Crown basically creates a government office, a sort of clearinghouse for everything going on in the New World. And this building in Seville becomes sort of a one-stop shop for everything going on, not just in a governmental sort of administrative sense, but everything scientific. So this office is going to be involved in things like customs duties and taxation and making sure that the Crown get its fair cut of trade with the New World. But it's also sharing information about what's coming back to Spain. And the Crown kind of considers these to be corporate secrets in a sense. It's not a corporate entity that he's founded, but these are, potential things, potential information that could be advantageous to the Spanish Crown in a world of competition with its other European competitors. So some of the things that it's very secretive about actually are things like pilot training. By that I mean navigator training, right? The Casa de Contratación is training the pilots who will steer these ships, hopefully to the right port to get them to where they need to be, and only in very limited senses letting the rest of Europe know about that information. That information is obviously also very important for the purposes of cartography. So some of the very first cartography is being done not only in Spain, but especially in places like Genoa in Italy. The Crown of Portugal, Henry the Navigator, famously, the Navigator, right? These things are sort of in part a shared process, but in the context of Spain, it's housed in one office where you have a whole bunch of persons in the same conversation with one another. And also developments around new instrumentation, right? So taking that knowledge from the Arab world, putting it into Latin and Spanish, and then also training persons on how to use these things like sextants, right? If you go out in the middle of nowhere and you need to find your way back home, like how do you do that? Well, it's really important that you learn how, and so the Casa de Contratación is doing that. What it's also doing, and this is really fascinating, is they're distributing a whole bunch of questionnaires. Literally every ship that is being sent out has a list of questions that they have to come back with. What are the people like? What do they eat? What are the plants like? Are there mineral resources? Right now, in part, the Crown's trying to get a sense for, are there things there that we can use, right? If you say there's a massive vein of silver, that probably means there's going to be a whole number of ships that are going to follow that initial expedition to start mining that silver. But they're also really curious about medicinal possibilities with plants, which is really interesting as well. In an ethnographic sense, they're also really, really curious about these peoples that they're encountering in the New World. They're in part a little bit selfish, looking for a labor source in the New World and realizing that that population is rapidly dying off because of epidemic disease, but trying in part to capture some of that information before it all sort of falls apart. But what I want to sort of stress here is science, as I'll describe it here in a moment, if we consider it to be science, is born in this context of commerce and trade and also empire, right? The fact that the crown is directing this and that it's not given to another corporation with its independent board of directors, but is part of the state is really important. So, the crown in the course of this colonization is also establishing some monopolies. So not companies that have total control over a given area of the world, but typically monopolies over a specific type of good. Okay, so at a later point, one of the more famous monopolies is on tobacco, right? There is one corporation in Spain that is allowed to access all of the tobacco grown in the New World, and it is given exclusive authority to produce cigarettes and cigars, right? So there's just one corporation, right, which gets to set the price. This is not a market system, but that's perhaps the most famous monopoly. There's a whole variety of monopolies that the Crown is trying to get underway because it understands that if it can get these monopolies going, those monopolies then are going to have to cut them part of the profit, right? So the Crown will get a little bit off the top from these corporations. They don't want competition because then there's too many companies for them to track and too many profits for them to sort of manage. If they have one institution, they know exactly where all of the books are, at least in their mind, and they can tax it appropriately. So the Crown is investing a lot of money in building up some of these monopolies. Part of that process then is sending out people to make these monopolies actually make money, right? So famously we have a figure by the name of Juan Tetzel, who, it's worth noting in Reformation history, there's a guy by the name of Johann Tetzel, who's a Dominican Catholic priest, not the same guy, totally different guy, right? Juan, not Johann. Juan Tetzel goes to Cuba during the 1540s. He looks firsthand at copper mining that's taking place there, comes back to Spain and basically says, okay, we're doing this all wrong. If we're going to cut a profit, having gone to site, gathered data, this is my recommendation. My conclusion is that we can perfect the process of copper mining in Cuba and other places based on my on-site study. Now, he's not talking about performing science, but if you look at the documents that he's collecting, he's basically doing field research, right? He's gathering information to draw a theory about what needs to happen. There's another figure by the name of Juan Cardenas who goes to Latin America and basically looks at the amalgamation process, which is for the most part what the Spanish are using to draw minerals out of ore, and saying here too, you know, we can do this better. I've gone firsthand on site, collected data, looked at ways to perfect this process. In part, he's not just performing science, but he's also performing a type of engineering, right? He's saying I can perfect how we do this technology. The Crown is also in the business of extending what they refer to as royal licenses to individuals, what we today probably think about more as sort of patents, right? Giving someone an exclusive right to a technology and to being able to reap the benefits of that technology. And we have in the Spanish archives a whole bunch of reports that come back from tests that are being taken to prove that these requests for royal licenses are in fact valid, right? They're not fraudulent or spurious claims about whether or not this technology is working. Just two examples here, 1531, 1532, there's documentation for bilge pumps, which are basically pumps on the side of a ship to keep it from taking on water. And so you can go through those and they literally have, you know, this ship goes out with this much tonnage, it doesn't sink, which is great. So in fact, the bilge pump works, you should extend them a patent. Those tests are becoming the foundation for whether or not the Crown determines if it's going to give a royal license. Now, if you think about this, the Crown, in a sense, doesn't necessarily need to do this, right? The king is supreme. He's absolute. He can do whatever he wants. But the fact that the Crown is requiring that there's proof, that there's evidence, this is evidence-based decision-making, that's really interesting. Now, again, they're not using necessarily the argument about, oh, we're using the scientific method, right? We have our hypothesis. But they're following a procedure that is largely the one we use today. Another one, in 1593, there is a request to authorize a fishing rake, which is basically exactly what it sounds like, right? A big rake to go along the bottom of the ocean and pull up some sea life. The concern is that there are oyster fishermen there, and they're concerned that if you pull a fishing rake across the bottom of the ocean, you're going to pull up all the oysters, and you're going to destroy the oyster beds, and you're going to ruin another industry while promoting another. So they have to do tests with this thing before the Crown is going to confer a license for a fishing rake. It wants to make sure that there is scientific evidence, in a sense, loosely using the word scientific, that that's not going to otherwise disrupt another important industry for this part of the empire. So the whole patent system is based off of evidence and doing testing. It's worth noting the Americas obviously have a lot of indigenous science on which they can build as well. I have two examples of some indigenous scientific / mathematical technology. So notably, the Inca of South America do not have writing. And for a long time, this was a big problem for anthropologists because they weren't sure how to talk about the Inca, right? They don't have writing. That's a fundamental marker of civilization. If you don't have writing, you're not a civilization. But they did have quipus, which are bundles of basically knots in various ropes. And the ropes vary in color, in length, in spacing, how big a knot is, how wide the space is between knots, tell you all sorts of mathematical information. It's almost, if you are familiar with what an abacus looks like, it kind of functions like an abacus. You can do double in accounting, right? Untie a knot here, add a knot at the other end. Some persons working in the field of literature even think that this is actually a type of writing insofar that they think some myths and legends and even historical accounts are being kept with knots, right? Think about the way in which you tell who a ruler is, right? Well, they rule between certain dates. You can represent those dates numerically. In English tradition, right, you have a whole bunch of Georges, and in French history, you have a whole bunch of Louis, right? Those are associated with numbers, so you can assign specific number values to rulers. You can also assign different colors to different maybe royal families or different reigns. But these quipus are really interesting. So the quipu kumayaks, or the keepers of the quipus, have all sorts of elaborate records in the Inca world about astronomy, about mathematics. And so we have evidence that the Spanish are actually trying to make sense of how to read the quipus. At a later point, all the quipu kumayaks are killed. Crown basically kills them all at one point. So that knowledge today for us is largely lost. But at one point, they're really curious, what's going on with all these records? Anthropologists today, instead of requiring writing as a basis for civilization, typically use the phrase record keeping. This is definitely a system of record keeping. Writing is too. It's a little bit more of an umbrella category. Famously, so the Mayan system is a base 20 system, right? We use a base 10, a decimal base system. DEC being a prefix for 10. The Maya have a notion of zero, which is really important, as I'm sure our mathematicians would agree. It's worth noting, at this point in time, the Catholic Church is arguing that you can't have a zero. In large part, this goes to notions of the theory of creation. Now, most indigenous belief systems say that at the beginning there is nothing, and then the world was created. So there's a notion of nothing, which works really well in a system wherein you have a zero. In the Catholic tradition, the view of the church is God has always existed. There was never a time when there was nothing. God was always there, and then the universe was created. So you always have to start with something. Thus, the concept of zero is something that the Catholic Church, and so by extent a lot of thinkers in Europe, resist pretty strongly for quite some time. Not everybody. I don't mean to imply that. The Church's hold certainly starts to wane around this period. But it's worth noting there's a lot of indigenous knowledge on which the science start to rely upon. We have great examples of this. I'm just going to talk about two here. In 1528, there's evidence that there's basically a local administrator by the name of Antonio de Villasante who's trying to make sense of a local herbal remedy. And his source for the curative properties of this thing are from his wife. Now notice her name, Carolina de Ayajibex. She's indigenous. This knowledge was taught to her. The crown is basically learning from indigenous peoples after hundreds of years of using some of this technology, what works, what doesn't work, and then ultimately using that to formulate some monopolies at a later point. Famously, in 1570, the then king, Philip II, ordered a man by the name of Francisco Hernandez to literally go to the Americas and interview indigenous peoples, right? They have a lot of knowledge. We need to figure out what it is so we can exploit it. In a sense, that's what the Crown is saying. But it's quite interesting when you think about this, that it's not just non-English speaking Europeans who are, in a sense, doing science in this period, but a source of authority in this period are actually indigenous people, right? The Crown recognizes more often than not, they're right about a lot of things, right? In fact, this does reduce fever, and this over here will stop you from coughing, and this over here might be a really reliable way to get silver out of ore, and so on. And so we have evidence that they're collecting data, again, based upon indigenous peoples as a source of information. There's also some really interesting things going on at a later point during the Enlightenment with Creoles. So Creoles are persons who are of European descent but born in the New World, right? So they're always second to persons who were born in the Old World, in Europe. But typically they're sort of more fair-skinned, they're typically upper class, and so in the sort of larger colonial world, they're looked down upon as not being European, but they're sort of at the pinnacle of the social hierarchy in the New World. My colleague Matt Crawford has done a lot of work on Kina, and he sort of looked at the way in which Creole participants in this transatlantic scientific community are working with Europeans, and he's found some really interesting developments. So for those of you who are not familiar with Kina, it is basically the bark, which looks like that when it's harvested. When it's refined, it kind of looks like cinnamon. Sometimes it actually curls up like cinnamon. The cinchona tree, it's named after one of the wives of a viceroy, the Marquesa de Chinchon, I want to say. And so sometimes in Spanish it's referred to as cinchona or chinchona, but also quina. Any guesses? What is that? Quinine, yeah, which is basically, it reduces fevers. It's an alkaloid-based drug. It is, for a long time, the only thing that the world has to ward off malaria and a lot of other drugs. I'm working on a project right now around yellow fever in the early part of the 19th century. And it's kind of funny because there's absolutely no evidence in that period that quinine actually does anything with yellow fever. But they're literally loading it into cannons and shooting it off in the streets as an effort to sort of like purify the city, right? This is a miracle drug. Surely it will do something. We'll just introduce it in large quantities. They're burning it. They're firing it off in cannons, all sorts of ways to introduce it into the local population. But in many ways, this is sort of like the miracle drug before penicillin existed. And the Spanish, for a long time, keep it secret. Right? They know they have a real lucrative industry here. But for a time, in the middle of the 18th century, the trees seem to be dying out. They're not quite sure if they can keep this thing going. And they have to rely on locals in Spanish America to try to keep this system going. And what's really interesting here is that we have Creoles, persons who in the rest of Europe are kind of looked down upon, right? They're Latin Americans, so they're in the other hemisphere. They're sort of like our children as Europeans who we rule over. Surely they cannot be telling us what to do. But we have these fascinating reports in 1769, for example, a magistrate of Forres, that's roughly how you translate his title, who's in the town of Loja, which is basically in the Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada, which is today about Ecuador, more or less. And he's sending powdered quina to the pharmacy saying, hey, maybe instead of sending all this bark, if we powder it down, it'll be more potent, and that'll be a more effective way of transporting it, and so we'll cut costs. But what we want you to do is test the powder. We want you to run basically clinical trials to see if the powder works as well as the bark, which for us shouldn't seem necessarily all that surprising, and for them probably shouldn't seem all that mysterious either, but the basis for determining whether or not they should move forward with this is basically a clinical trial, right? They send it to the Royal Pharmacy in Madrid, and it has ultimately responsibility for running those trials. I don't know that we have the evidence for what the trials did. We just have the letter saying, hey, Here's your collection of powder, like go do something with it. But still, that suggests something about larger processes that are at work in the empire at this point. And then in 1779, we have this fascinating report from someone who is, it's not clear exactly where he is, but he's probably in Guayaquil, which is modern-day Ecuador as well. So as you might imagine, there's a lot of these trees in modern-day Ecuador, or what was Ecuador. What will eventually become Ecuador. And so we have this figure by the name of Miguel García de Cáceres, who's writing this treatise, basically telling the Europeans they have no clue what they're talking about. He basically calls out sort of credentialed European scholars, as he refers to them, los inteligentes, as being wrong. He basically says, you haven't talked to the local population. Like, we've been looking at this problem. We've basically been deploying science to make sense of what's going on, and you're getting it all wrong. You need to do X, Y, and Z to fix the Quina monopoly and restore the crown's profit. Now, not surprisingly, when the crown gets a letter like that, this is the way you make more money. The crown goes along with the person telling them how to make more money. So the crown actually, in a sense, recognizes knowledge coming in from Latin America on roughly egalitarian terms with what's going on in Europe in this period. And that's really significant, right? It says that we don't necessarily have a hierarchy working in the scientific community, or what you might imagine as sort of an early modern scientific community, which otherwise does work in a sort of more social sense at this point, right? If you're a Creole, you're not the same as a European-born Spaniard in this period. But your knowledge, if you can test and you can run sort of experiments, then you're basically on par with someone who holds a university degree in Europe. So the standard here is evidence and proof and method in a sense, not necessarily credentials. So it tells us something about how sort of these processes function in the Spanish world. So some takeaways to throw out there and to think about. And these might be somewhat controversial, but hopefully this sort of problematize things just a little bit. The idea that science and the scientific method are not a uniquely Anglo-Saxon creation, right? Again, if you say it's a Baconian revolution, right? You're saying it's specifically about Bacon and it's specifically about a certain community in a certain part of Europe, as opposed to a broader community that is actually involved in a far more complex process in this period. A big question here is the role of indigenous people. Now, I've tried to point out some instances in which we have records of indigenous peoples being a part of this process. The evidence isn't really reliable, in part because we don't have records in the indigenous languages in most parts, so we don't necessarily know how indigenous communities are interacting with the crown. All right, you're always having to read against bias, right? So, you know, occasionally Spaniards might say we talk to indigenous people. It might be the case that they're talking to them a lot, but they want to take credit for the discovery, and so they're not necessarily talking about who they talked about or who they talked to and giving their reports. But the little bit of evidence we have uncovered probably suggests that this process is one that's actually interethnic. There's a lot of diverse peoples involved in this process that historically we haven't really given much attention to. So in a sense here, it's not just Europeans, right? The scientific revolution then isn't necessarily uniquely European. Arguably, we have people in what is today Latin America, right? Creoles and indigenous peoples involved in creating science in the 1500s before Bacon ever publishes his book. Now, again, Bacon formalizes things, right? He gives words to the method and he describes this is what you're doing, whether you knew it or not. But arguably, the process and the methods exist before he articulates them in a really sort of formal fashion. What I think here then is also really interesting is in the Spanish Empire, at least, there's evidence here that empiricism can sort of level a social gap, right? If you are showing evidence, if you are running tests, you're doing experiments, it doesn't matter whether or not you have a flashy title from the University of Salamanca. Who matters here and who is recognized by the crown are those who are following a particular set of practices. And that's really, really important. It's worth noting, tied to this as well, the Spanish aren't always great with indigenous communities. They do a lot of horrible, brutal, nasty things. But Compare them then with the English, I think it's worth noting as well, right? The English have a far more arguably genocidal history of interaction with Native American communities, right? So indigenous communities typically are completely segregated. This is why today in the United States we have reservations, right? Isolated off as a separate tribal community. In the Spanish world, generally there's a lot more interaction. There's a lot more intermarriage, a lot more ongoing traditions that sort of overlap, right? You look at religion in modern Mexico today and something like Day of the Dead, like it's an overlap of the older Aztec religious tradition and Catholic practices. So there's a lot of mixing going on there. There's cultural syncretism. You don't see that to the same extent in the British American colonies. So last question I'll throw out there is whether or not the scientific revolution happened, right? So think about this. As scientists, does science magically start happening in the 17th century? Did people just wake up one day and decide, oh, hey, we're going to start doing science. Let's make a method, right? Or is it older than that? But we start thinking about it as a set of practices and a set of beliefs and a certain valid set of ways in which you know what is truth that develops at that point in time. Because it's worth noting, you know, a lot of these things, I could devote a whole nother lecture to this. A whole lot of these ideas are also coming to the Iberian Peninsula via Arabs, right? And so Arabs are bringing knowledge from other parts of the world. In a sense, they've already been practicing science. The Europeans just didn't know that, right? And so it's not that the scientific revolution happens on a world stage in the 17th century, but rather that's only when Europeans catch on, in a sense. Up until that point, they're lagging behind the rest of the world. They're at that point playing catch up, but celebrating it as the creation of this thing, as opposed to, you know, jumping on the bandwagon that's already been going on for a while. So I'll stop it there. We have a little bit of time if you have any questions. But yeah, thanks for coming. So, any quick questions? Otherwise, you can totally head off. Yeah.
How could the Crown stop other people from doing those enterprises?
Yeah, so the Crown liked to think that it could, and there was totally a black market everywhere for all sorts of stuff. But officially, if you were caught, you could be fined or imprisoned as basically a criminal, right? So you were violating the royal charter that said only persons operating under the auspices of this organization have the right and the authority in terms of the Crown. To go against that is to go against the Crown and the King himself. So there's a black market for sure. Yeah. A big black market in some places at various points.